Happy to do what I can.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is the Coaching Club. My name is Mark Dayton. I'm the Who Coach. And tonight, or whenever you are looking at this, we are going to be talking about the topic of perspective and hopefully explore some interesting thoughts and ideas around that. So buckle up and thanks for joining us. I want to start with this. When I was a young boy, I grew up in the city of Price, Utah. I was born there and I grew up there until I was about 9 years old. Price is just a little coal mining town down in Carbon County, interestingly enough. And I had a great childhood growing up. And I distinctly remember my first day of school in Price, Utah. The elementary school wasn't too far from our house, and my mom said that I should be walking to school. So it was Durant School, Durant Elementary School. And I still remember our house. It was 711 North 4th East. I remember I had to memorize that so that I would know my address. And it still stuck with me. So I got up that day and I grabbed my lunch, said goodbye to my mom, and I headed down the driveway. And our driveway was this big driveway, big long driveway. And I got down the driveway out to the sidewalk, and then I started walking to school. And I passed my couple of neighbors' houses that I used to play with, and I passed my kindergarten teacher's house. And I wound my way through the neighborhood until I got to the corner of the school lot. And it seemed like such a long time to get there, but I got to the corner of the school lot. And I knew I was there because there was this big chain link fence all the way around the school lot. And I remember looking up and thinking, I am so glad they have a big, strong fence here to keep all of the children safe. And so I walked along and looking up at that big, tall fence once in a while, walked and walked and walked and walked and walked. And I finally got to the gate and I went in the gate to the playground, and it was this expansive playground. And I needed to get to my class, so I hurried across the playground, but it was more and more walking and walking. And finally, I got to my classroom, and my teacher greeted me and had a great experience. So, fast forward about 30 something years, and we were headed back down that direction on a road trip. And I thought, I want to go see the old homestead and see Durant School and relive all those memories. So we we drove over to 711 North 4th East, and I pulled up in front of the house, and there was this very small 2-car wide driveway. And I thought, well, I'm just gonna walk the old path, to to the school. So walked down the driveway. It was not far. Walked past my neighbors and got to the school corner where the fence was, and it was about a block and a half, maybe. And I got to the fence, and I was expecting this big, giant, security fence, and it was just a normal height chain link fence. And I walked another half a block, maybe, to the gate, and walked into a modest size playground, and then over to the school. So, what would be your takeaway from comparing those two different experiences? What observations would you have?
Well, it's funny that you asked that because just this past weekend, I was in my hometown,
Oh, really?
which is a small town in southern Utah, and we had some time, and so we drove around most of the little town, and it was startling how tiny everything was, how
Oh,
small everything was by comparison, and where we used to walk to school was just a couple of blocks. Where we used to walk to church was 3 or 4 blocks. And I used to think that was so far. And now it's like, oh, just around the corner, you know?
Right there, yeah.
And and houses that were there now look dramatically different. Houses that weren't there, of course, fill formerly vacant lots. And and it was just it was a strange experience because former trip down there not all that long ago, I made the statement that everything looks exactly the same, but it's all completely different.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just it's obviously perspective. It's a matter
Yeah.
of our childhood perspective versus our theoretic adult perspective, and being able to look at things through different eyes, and just the way you feel about things in different situations, different settings.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's wonderful that you had that same experience.
It was cool. Yeah,
It was pretty shocking to me because, those things that seemed so huge and so far were not at all.
yeah, yeah.
And so it really struck me that, perspective, like you said, and maturity,
Hmm.
it's not that it's not that for me as a 6-year-old that was wrong or bad or false or anything else. That was my perception of the world, right? But as I matured, I got closer to the truth of what things really are, right? And
Hmm.
get mature out of seeing things as a child and move into seeing things for what they really are.
Right.
And so to me, it seems that perspective is a lot of perspective is walking that path and working toward truth,
Mm.
working toward understanding truth and how that impacts my life and how I may be perceiving things in possibly an immature way at any age, right?
Right.
At any age.
Yes.
Okay, here's another one. So fast forward about, I don't know, 10 years. And my family had a very strong Christmas tradition. It was like Christmas Eve was a big deal. We had a meal, and we had a play, usually with music and speaking parts, and I mean all kinds of stuff. And so and the grandparents came, and it was really a big deal. And there was always a high level of excitement, and then the kids would hang up their stockings, and then they would go to bed. And so that was my perception. And then in the morning, it was like, oh wow, Santa thought, Santa got me this, and how did he know, and all that kind of stuff. And even when I got older and I knew about Santa, it was still a magical time. It was
Hmm.
really kind of a nostalgic experience. But I turned 18 that year, and we did all of the traditional stuff, and kids went to bed, and I was kind of like in between childhood and adulthood, so I was in that awkward phase, I guess. And my dad said, so do you want to help with the presents tonight? And I thought, okay, sure. So we got in the car and we drove down to his office, which was down in the center of town. And underneath the office was a storage area. And he opened up the doors down there, and there was this entire Christmas down in the storage area. And I was just like, I had no idea. I had no idea where my parents were stocking all this stuff. And as I looked at it, I thought, uh, okay, I know there's no Santa, right? But it struck me that wow, that is a lot of work. And I had also just started working. And so I started doing the calculations on it, and money was pretty important to me. And I thought, that is a lot of money. And I had never even thought about it before. And as we loaded everything up and took it up to the house, I had a whole new view on my parents and their love for me and for our family and what they were trying to accomplish with all of that. So same question there. What would be your takeaway from that kind of an experience? What insights would you see?
Well, as I reflect on my own, excuse me, Christmas experiences as a kid, um, it did kind of become delusion. I mean, I became a bit disillusioned when I realized reality,
Okay.
and that that all this fantastical stuff that I had believed and accepted as reality forever was not
Yeah.
what I had originally thought it was, was. And due to a lot of other things that won't go into, I became very cynical
Hmm.
about Christmas and about a lot of the whole mentality of it. And
Yeah.
so it's taken me a long time to reverse a lot of that cynicism and begin to open up again to the magic, as it were, of Christmas. That while it wasn't as magical and as fantastical as I believed it to be as a young child, it can still be really special and really neat.
Hmm.
Um, when I allow my cynicism to fade and allow myself to focus on the good aspects and the enjoyable, fun aspects of it, and not being hung up with some of the mess that I've allowed to get in my way for too many years.
Huh. That is so interesting. So interesting. Would you mind sharing just a little bit about, I'm really curious about what were the what were the messages or the stories on the cynical side that were running around in your head, and how did you transform that to something else?
Due to some things from childhood, I allowed myself to move to a cynical perspective on pretty much everything in life.
Hmm.
And it was kind of no matter how dark the day was, I could find a way to pull the shades on it still, you know, and and uh, and find something negative about the most positive and uplifting and inspiring aspects of life.
Hmm.
And as I begun to realize, as I began to realize um, that my perspective was coloring my entire life, and that it wasn't taking me in the direction that I wanted it to go, and that my my cynicism was impacting my own personal sense of happiness, of well-being, my well-being in relationships and other aspects of life. um, I began reviewing where that cynicism had come from,
Hmm.
and as I began to recognize that, I've spent a lot of years and a lot of time and effort in finding ways to I was going to say dampen and stop that, but I'm going to change that and say I've spent a lot of time and effort in releasing
Hmm.
that and allowing that to dissipate and to go away, and and to begin, pardon me, start looking for the good, start looking for the positive aspects of life, start looking for the things that are uplifting and appropriate and helpful, as opposed to continuing to dwell on negative and dark aspects of things, because everything has two sides.
Right.
And for a long time I would look at people and I would think, how can this person be positive or be upbeat or be an uplifting in an uplifted mentality when their situation is, as I saw it, so horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And they never stopped to recognize and accept and realize that I was fortunate that my circumstances may have been better than some of the people that I was interacting with, who I saw in being in negative or what I would have termed to be bad circumstances. Yet
Yeah,
they
yeah,
didn't see it that way. They didn't have the cynicism. They didn't have the negativity. They didn't have the dark perspective that I seemed to carry with me. And so it's just been a gradual awakening, I guess,
yeah, yeah.
um, to to the fact that reality is really largely what I determine it to be. And and it can be as ugly and negative and dark and nasty as I want to conjure it to be,
Huh.
or it can be great and wonderful and light and inspiring, despite challenges that can and do come along.
Sure.
And so it's a matter of looking toward or looking away from the source of light, whether it be the sunshine or a light or the savior or whatever the source as I perceive it to be.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I applaud your journey. That is some of the hardest work we ever do as human beings is to,
It is challenging and
yeah,
it's you find yourself you find yourself questioning and re-examining and revisiting pretty much everything that you think and that you feel and that you believe, and that it's been challenging for me to get to the point where I'm willing to release and let go of some of those things that, even though I knew they were harmful or negative or not supporting me, not benefiting me, that's what I'd lived for decades.
yeah, yeah.
That was reality to me. and
Sure.
and being being willing to climb out of a pool of cold, nasty water or mud, it would seem that that would be a desirable and pleasant thing to do. But I'd been there so long that felt
That
like
was,
nature,
that,
like home, like that's where I belong.
that was life. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow. Wow. Well, the willingness is often the big first step.
right.
It's like, I am willing, when you get to the point where you can say, I am willing to consider that maybe I'm wrong about this,
Yeah.
and and I'm willing to consider that maybe there's a different way to look at this.
Mhm.
I really appreciate what you said about looking at people who are in really difficult circumstances and scratching your head and saying, how could they possibly have a smile on their face? How
Right.
can
Right.
so
I,
being
I
willing to look at that, that's
yeah. I was stunned by a situation many years ago, and it took me decades to allow this to really let sink in, I guess. But many years ago, I was riding with a co-worker, so to speak, in his car, and he was kind of trying to pump me up. I was feeling pretty sorry for myself, and as we drove up it was at State Street there in Salt Lake City, and there was a little store that's no longer there. It was, I think, on the corner of 1700 South and State Street.
mhm.
As we drove by, and I was whining and feeling sorry for myself, the door opened to that little store, and this fellow walked out, and he had the crutches that clamp on your forearms,
All right.
and his legs were twisted. He was stumbling as he came out, and he could barely walk. And as I looked at him, he had a big old smile on his face.
Ah,
And I looked in the mirror and I said, "You sorry SOB, if that poor dude can smile, what exactly is wrong with you?" You know? And And I still continue to feel sorry for myself for many decades after that. But that's something that has stuck with me for, gosh, 45 plus years.
Wow.
That has been really impactful as I've reflected on it over the years and thought it was totally up to that guy to decide what kind of day he was going to have.
Yeah, yeah. That is remarkable. What a cool experience. It's one of those, the fence around the school really is only 6 feet. It's not 15 feet high.
Right. Right.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, the willingness and then just the heart. It's hard work. It's
It is
hard
hard work.
to let go because we have our stories and
Yes.
we have our justifications,
Yes.
and that's how we navigate life, and that's how we
Hmm.
navigate the world. And when somebody or something comes in and says, "Hmm, maybe you ought to look at it a different way," the first reaction is, "No, no, this is the only way."
Yep.
And
This is the way it's always been, and this is the
yeah,
way it's supposed to be.
and maybe that works for you, but
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yep.
Okay, let me share one other one here. I'd like us to explore a little bit. So, have a close friend who he's a younger friend who was who got married, fell in love, got married, and things were okay for the first 6 months or so, and then things started going south. And the big breaking point was his wife. Okay, so he was in the music industry. That was his work. And he wanted to go out to concerts and to plays, and he wanted to be out and about with people. And she wanted to stay home. And so he started staying home with her, but every once in a while he would say, I really want to go to this concert. And so you can come with me, or you can stay here and watch TV, or it, but I really want to go. So he started doing these things, and she got really, really upset and started telling him and her best girlfriends, he doesn't love me, he doesn't care for me, and I'm pretty sure he's stepping out on me. There's got to be another woman involved here. And so got to the point where she was so sure that that was the case that she filed for divorce. And in the meantime, her best friends, one of whom was a good family friend, started spreading the story about what was happening with this man. So, what would be your thought on what would be your perception on that kind of a situation?
It's interesting. I've asked several other people the same question. Have you ever talked to both sides of a divorce?
Hmm.
You know, and most of the people I talk to say they haven't had that opportunity. And I've it's been interesting as I've had a couple of situations, a few situations where I've been able to talk to both individuals,
Hmm.
and they seem like events that happened thousands of years apart on totally different planets in far distant galaxies. They seem so completely unrelated, so completely unconnected, so totally different that you think, have you two ever met? Have you two ever even talked to each other? And
Yeah,
and the the perception that it's always the other person's fault. It's never my fault. It's always the other person's fault. From both parties. Well, he's always so selfish. He's always this one. She was always nagging me this, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's impossible, from my perspective, to get an honest perception of what really happened there because they're two very, very divergent stories.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I'm learning to try to not judge. When I hear just one side of a story, I'm learning to try to not judge either party, because I realize that I'm hearing something that very almost certainly has another side somewhere.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I don't know if that addresses your question really,
No,
but
that's really fascinating. Yeah, because getting back to, I think what we're trying to do is get to what is the truth? You know, what's the
right.
actual truth? All the stories, all the victimization, all the
Yeah.
blaming, all the whatever. But what is the actual truth? I think it's really interesting that you say they never even talk to each
Yeah.
other. It's
It
like
seems like
you're
they never,
saying
never
this and
met.
I think this, and yeah. So yeah. Well, I did have the opportunity to sit down with each of them individually. I didn't sit down with them
Right.
together because they didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
But listening to each side of the story, it was so interesting that huge misperceptions
Yeah.
for the most part.
Yeah.
And he categorically denied that there was anything going on with another woman. She was absolutely sure that there was. Um, and that was her story, and she was sticking to it, and
Yeah.
all of her friends were spreading that around. And um, the truth, it seemed to me, when I really looked at it, was the truth was he really was an extrovert. He was somebody who really needed to be out with people, and she
Mhm.
was very much an introvert, a homebody. And so that was the truth, and that was an incompatibility. But everything else was stories, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And it was stories to defend that their version of that truth, you know.
Right.
But so it was really, really interesting to me to see from not only from understanding, maybe getting closer to the truth, but also looking at it through more mature eyes. And the wife and her friends especially were pretty young and inexperienced, and so they were making snap judgments and going with it. And with a little more maturity and maybe a little more humility and willingness to say, well,
Mhm.
maybe I got it wrong here. Let me look at it from a different perspective or from different eyes. And
And it's interesting too how when an individual jumps to a conclusion that way, it seems to close off all other possibilities.
yes,
You get to the point where you say, okay, this is the way it has to be because this is the way I see it, and other options don't exist. There's no possibility that he could be doing this when
right,
I'm already convinced that he's doing that, and so that's the way it is.
yeah,
And you just you begin to continue to find evidences of your beliefs and ignore obvious signs of anything that opposes or is contrary in any way to your belief.
yeah.
And everything continues to reinforce that belief system that a person has decided to accept and adopt.
So true, so true. And we see that gap in, I mean, everywhere in the world these days.
Mhm.
People
Yep.
just dig in their heels and they're so sure that the other side is wrong, or that you're prejudiced, or that, whatever it is they've decided. And there's not the willingness and I call it curiosity, I'm a really curious person.
Mhm.
And I've been stuck in my share of stories. It's like, no,
Sure.
this is the way it is.
Right.
I'm really curious, and I really want to know, okay, well, what is the truth,
Mhm.
And why did that person act that way? Or why did they decide to do that? And maybe I'm getting a little more mature in my years, and I've had enough experience to know that if you get stuck in your story, then it generally leads to a dead end of not very happy things because it's not founded on truth.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and last night was a good example of it with the presidential debate. You know,
uh-huh,
um, I am quite interested in politics. I follow it fairly closely. I'm
hmm,
very strongly opinionated, but I am really fascinated about what somebody else believes, and I like to get involved and find out what the other side thinks. How do they feel about a certain situation, and what's their position on this and on that and whatever, so that I can make what I feel to be an educated decision
sure,
based on what I perceive, that one party versus the other party, or one candidate versus the other candidate, what they believe, what they stand for, what they think, how they feel.
yeah,
And then I feel that I can make a decision that's based on what I perceive to be true rather than what talking heads on TV or a certain source on the internet or whatever like this
sure, yeah, yeah.
seems to advocate.
I missed the debate. I had another meeting last night, but I heard it was lively.
That would be a good description of it. Yes.
Well, yeah, so that's kind of the essence of what I wanted to kick around with you tonight. Let me just share one closing thing here. I'll share my screen.
Okay.
See if I can bring this up. Can you see that?
Can, yes.
Okay. So the more I thought about this, and I'm a person who I like to kind of see things as simply as I can to start with.
Hmm.
Kind of what are the big issues and what are the big ideas here? Then dive deep. But at the end of the day, I like to be able to boil it all down to, okay, well, what's the takeaway?
Hmm.
What are the two or three things that are going to change my life or make a difference in all of the everything that we've talked about and looked at? So as I was going through that exercise with this is what I came to. And I don't know if you can see that. There's very faint there, but to me,
That is.
it's a process of these two things getting closer and closer and clearer together,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Until they're in alignment. And
Right.
when they're in alignment, when our perception is aligned with truth, that's where things get really powerful. And that's where we can see more clearly. That's where we can have better insights into what really matters in life and what really makes a difference. Until I like to think about it as they're kind of one,
Right.
the protrutive.
Right.
So when those are totally aligned, we have
I
the
was curious how you were going to meld those. That's cool.
it doesn't flow off the tongue very well, but
Right. But it illustrates the point very well.
yeah, yeah, coming together. And the longer I live, the more I believe that this is what maturity is about too. When we think about maturity, well, what's maturity? Maturity is it's experience, it's all of those things. But at the end of the day, a mature outlook is being able to really align with truth and align your perspective with what's really true out there. So for me, the takeaways here are to ask this question. My wife was involved with a I guess you call him a life coach years ago, who had some really great insights. And this is the phrase that he used that has stuck with me for decades now. And I love it because it boils it all down to, okay, I've heard all the stories, I've heard all the victim stances, I've heard all the data, I've heard everything, but what is the truth really? And when you ask that question, like I said, it has to be, we have to come at it from the willingness to be sincere and honest and curious and question our own position. Otherwise, we get stuck in our stories and we dig in our heels and we say, well, that can't be true, and that kind of thing. And it doesn't mean that we have to believe what everything that somebody else is telling us, but to get to the truth really, particularly in relationships, it requires, as you so beautifully illustrated. Again, thank you for sharing that. But it's a lot of hard work, it really
Mhm.
is. And you've got to be willing to sincerely and honestly question and be curious about why I believe this, and um, why am I holding on to this story, right?
Mhm.
And then the other key question that I found to be very helpful is, what is my role in this? So a lot of times I get stuck in this. Well, they said this and they said that and this and but if I step back and say, and what what have I done that contributed to this? Or
Right.
that, that maybe skewed their belief, or, whatever. So what is my role and what is my part in this? So those two questions I find to be really, really helpful in keeping perspective that is as closely aligned with truth as possible.
Mhm. And one of the really difficult parts of that is to recognize that I always have a role in it.
Yes.
No matter what happens, despite how much I want to feel like a victim, I have a role in it.
Yeah.
And when I'm willing to accept that I have a role, define, recognize my role, and then accept I guess, the consequences of my assuming that role,
Hmm.
regardless of how active or passively I accepted that role, then I can start looking at how what could I do, or what could I have done in that situation that would have, what did I do that exacerbated or brought it about, or what could I have done that would have potentially uh, changed the outcome or the results of the situation.
Absolutely. That's a very, very mature way of looking at it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, that's what I had tonight.
Cool.
Thank you for joining, and
Thank you.
we'll hopefully see you again on a.
Yes.
Sure. Any parting thoughts?
I know. I really appreciate the discussion on perspective, because for so much of my life, I was trapped in a what I'll call a victim
Hmm.
perspective,
Yeah.
and as long as I was a victim, um, I was out of control. It was always someone else's fault. Always, I was just that. I was at someone else's beck and call, as it were, or just at their mercy, so to speak.
Sure.
And as I began to recognize that I had this victim mentality, which I think everyone has to a certain degree,
Absolutely.
and waking up and recognizing that was it was shocking to me.
Yeah.
It was stunning when I came to realize that I was facing the whole world as a victim. And man, I didn't want to recognize that. I did not want to accept that. That was much more painful than a lot of the other things that I had endured.
Yeah.
as a victim, and accepting that I had allowed myself to act and think and feel and behave as a victim when I could have made a different choice.
Mhm.
One of the big results of that is guilt.
Sure. Oh,
You
yeah.
know, you can start beating yourself to death saying, oh, I could have, should have, would have, this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then learning, and rather than say the word guilt, I should say shame, because there
Shame.
is a
Yeah.
significant difference.
Definitely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and learning to allow myself to let go of that shame, learning to forgive myself, learning to move on beyond that and accept whatever is as the current state of being, and that I have the opportunity to do something about it going forward,
Wow.
is very liberating.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
But you have to go
so
through that dark night of the
you do.
awful realization of where you've been, and
Yes.
when you have that, when the lights go on, I had this same experience at one point in my life, and I was just like, oh my goodness, look what I have done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look where I have been all these years.
Yes. Yes. It's
It like
stunning.
cuts to the core. It does.
Yeah.
It really does.
It's it is. I mean, to say it's painful is not an overstatement, because
No, no,
um like I say, it's extremely easy to for a person to beat themselves up and spend a lot of time in wallowing in that shame, and once again go back to victimhood and poor pity me because all of this bad stuff happened,
sure.
when that doesn't accomplish anything. It's a matter of saying, okay, this is a new start, this is a new day for me, this is a way that I can now turn this way instead of that way, or whatever it is, and do things differently. And
Absolutely.
so,
The truth
so
is that those things happened and that I did those things. That's the
right,
truth. But
right,
the truth also is, as you just said, the truth is that from now on, I can do something different.
different,
That's
yes, yeah,
hugely liberating. Hugely.
yes, yes, very much so.
Okay.
So cool. Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for the discussion. I always learn
Right.
something new when I have these discussions. So thank you. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. There's always more to learn, and there's always more ways to grow. And if nothing else, a reminder of helping me get back centered again, so to speak, and say, this is okay. Yeah, I kind of I knew that, but I'd forgotten it, or it's just it's a new, it's helpful to once again be reminded and refocus on that. So it was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
You
Take
too.
care. Bye bye.
Care.